Welcome back, crewmates. Today we're going to be going over a couple more tournament deck lists that have topped some recent events. The event was the One Piece flagship tournament, and there were two deck lists posted up, being the second and first place list. As we get into these, go ahead and jet pistol that sub button and the bell, so that you get all of our One Piece card game bids in the future. First up, we've got the Captain Kidd deck coming in second place, the mono green leader that can, once per turn at the cost of 3, discard a card from your hand and switch him to active so he can swing twice a turn. Very simple but efficient effect on the leader that you will always have access to throughout the game. Go ahead and going into the 1-drops with 4 copies of Capone. He is your basic green blocker. Very handy to have such a cheap negate attack on the board at any time. We have Jewelry Bonnie. Pay 1 and rest her to check the top 5 cards of your deck for any Supernova card and add it to your hand. Very good for consistency, and this deck plays a good number of Supernova cards, as any green deck pretty much does. Playing 4 copies of the Momonosuke. The exact same effect as Bonnie before him, but checks for a Wano type card, so you have a good amount of consistency search cards in this deck list. 4 copies of the 2-drop Killer Blocker, who has an effect with a Dawn under him when blocking. If you have 3 or more characters, you can draw a card when he blocks. I really like this card. It allows you to replace your blockers with another card immediately when he blocks, but you do have to be mindful of your board when playing the card, because he only gets his effect when you have 3 or more characters. He does count himself, which is always nice. 4 copies of Apu, so his effect is pretty much irrelevant as far as I'm concerned when attacking with a Dawn under him. Rest one of your opponent's Dawn cards. The reason that you play him at 4 at all is because he has 2000 counter for green, and he is a Supernova. So you can get him off Bonnie if you need some more guard in your hand, and so you don't whiff. 4 copies of Cat Viper. 2-drop, 3k. On play, rest an opponent's character with cost of 3 or less. This is very handy for not only resting characters so that you can attack into them, but specifically on a turn when you want to push, you can rest their little blockers like Capone. And then you can swing on past them, and then have like a little guy go into the Capone, because they only have 1,000. 2 copies of the Trigger Killer that says on play, KO an opponent's rested character with a cost of 3 or less. I really like this number of the Killer at 2. I've been testing green with playing 2 Killer in my list as well. 4 copies of Raizo, who is searchable off the Momo. His effect is if you have 2 or more rested characters when he attacks, you can draw 1 card. That is absolutely free. All you need to do is make sure you have the board set up, and the Momo and Bonnie combo with this by saying they can tap themselves the turn they're play. So if you have no board, and you just have the Raizo, say, active, because you do have to set him up, you can play the Bonnie or the Momo on the turn you're going to attack with Raizo, go ahead and use their skills, and then you can draw a card off Raizo. 3 copies of the Ukiku with a Dawn under him when attacking. Once per turn, rest an opponent's character with cost 5 or less, similar to the Cat Viper, but a higher cost threshold. But you do have to set up because it needs to attack to do that skill. 4 copies of Izal on play, rest an opponent's character with cost 4 or less. Well, green has a lot of these on play tap cards, which are very nice for just plowing through little blockers or things that are going to try and stop your big attacks, because your leader kid can become a 12k double attacker by putting 7 Dawn under him, and then using his skill for 3, you can go 12 twice. So getting rid of the little blockers that would stop him from going for face is very handy. Iza also has 2000 guard and is searchable off the Momonosuke. 2 copies of the 6k Dropper Law. The 6k Blocker Law at 5 cost, and then on play you can use his Shambles ability to return any character to your hand and then replace it with a cost 3 or less from your hand, which can be used for Killer. You can replace it with a blocker, you can replace it with Cat Viper and Izal that can tap other blockers your opponent has. Playing 2 copies of that, it is pretty easy to get to with the Jewelry Bonnie. 2 copies of X-Drake, the 5-drop 6k that says on play you can KO any of your opponent's rested characters, cost 4 or less. I like that this is a 2-of. I saw a lot of lists playing like the full playset. I don't think it's that amazing to play a full playset. is playing 3 copies of the starter deck 7-drop 7k blocker kit. I really like this card and I want to test more with it. I think this card is comparable to the 8-drop kit, if not better, just because you are able to decide when this blocks instead of the other kid just being a giant magnet that forces everything to attack into it. You get to choose what you block with this card, and he's very similar in the fact that he can attack and then still be a blocker because his end phase skill is with a Dawn under him, you can switch him to active. So you can swing, and then at the end of your turn, switch him back to active so that he can block on the opposing turn. And if you notice, this list is actually playing 3 of the blocker kid and only 2 of the 8-drop 8k kid, who is infamous right now as he says Dawn 1 opponent's turn. If this character is rested, your opponent cannot attack anything other than Captain Kid. So he is a giant wall that absorbs all the attacks, but he's there. He's staring your opponent in the face, and your opponent knows he's there, and he's going to take all the attacks. Whereas the blocker is standing there and going, I could block this, but the player has the choice to decide when to block with it. So that flexibility might make the 7-drop blocker a bit better. Plus 7-drop is really good stat-wise for a blocker. A 7k blocker is massive and very easy to guard out so that he won't die. And then of course, the secondary effect is allows him to rest himself and then play a cost 3 or less from your hand, which not only gives you a guy for free, allows you to actually activate his effect the turn he's played. And the last 4 cards in the deck are the 4 Paradise Waterfall, a fantastic 1-cost event for green that gives anybody 2,000 and then allows you to stand one of your characters so that they can't be attacked for the remainder of the turn under normal circumstances. So it's a very good defensive card, actually. And the trigger allows you to just pop anything with cost 4 or less as long as they're rested if it's triggered from the damage. Now, that handles the Kid deck. Moving on to the first place deck list, which is actually the Doflamingo deck list. Doflamingo's effect is as follows. With 2 down under him, you can pay 1 when he attacks to check the top card of your deck. And if it is a 7 Warlords of the Sea type character with a cost of 4 or less, you may play it for free in Rested. So, you're going to have a bunch of these 4 cost or lower 7 Warlords of the Sea cards in your deck, and you're going to try and get its nice advantage engine rolling as you just play guys for 1 every single turn and just try and just out-resource the opponent. One of my favorite cards in this list, of course, is this list is playing 4 copies of Perona, and on play lets you check the top 5 cards of your deck and rearrange them in any order that you wish, and then put them back on the top, or if you don't like any of them, you can put them on the bottom. This is just a really good card in blue in general that I play in pretty much any blue deck that I would play, but in this deck it is very, very specific that you can make the top card of your deck whatever card that you want to hit off of the Doflamingo. So if you look at the top 5, you're able to go, I want to play this off Dofi, and then I'm going to draw, and then I'm going to play this off Dofi, and then I'm going to draw, and then of course, if you have other draw cards in your card pool, it really lets you use your 5-head powers, so that you can go, maybe I'm going to draw and then play with the Dofi, and then, you know. So there's a lot of actual use for this card, other than just go, oh, look at the top 5, and think about it. 2 copies of the Trafalgar Law. Now, 2 copies of this is actually interesting because you don't actually want to hit this off the Dofi. You don't really get much value off of it because it is 1,000 and it is played and rested, so anything in the game is going to swing into this and kill it. You'd rather actually hard draw this card and just play him for 1, but he is playable off the Dofi, and he combos really well with Moria later on in the list. 3 copies of Alvida. The effect of Alvida is with a Dawn under when she attacks, you can discard a card from your hand to return an opponent's character with cost 3 or less to their hand. That effect's not going to come up very often because the main reason you play Alvida is because she is 2,000 guard. And the fact that she's only a buggy pirate and not a 7 Warlords does lead to some awkward scenarios when you're trying to resolve Dofi, unfortunately. The 3-drop Dofi blocker is extremely good in this deck because he is not only a target for the Dofi, but on play lets you check top 5 cards of your deck and put them in any order you want, just like the Perona. So even more synergy than the Perona in general, because you can actually play this off the Dofi and then also check top 5 again. The 4-drop 5k blocker Kuma says on KO play 1 Pacifista card with a cost 4 or less from your hand whenever he's killed. 4 copies of Dracul Mihawk, who is in fact playable off of the Dofi leader because he is 4-drop and a 7 warlord. But he also has 2000 guard, and his on-field effect is really good too. With the Dawn under him, when attacking, draw 2 cards and discard any 2 cards from your hand. Moria is the starter deck Moria, the 4-drop 5k, who I think is probably the best card in the deck. You know, it is possibly debatable because Bo is really good, but this card pluses immediately on play, even off of the Dofi leader effect. It says, when played at any 7 Warlords of the Sea or Thriller Bark Pirates, character with a cost of 4 or less other than himself, from your trash to your hand. So you get a 5k attacker off of the Dofi skill and rested, and then when he's played, you immediately get to get something from your graveyard. And there's a lot of things you can get. You can get defense, and you can also get offense, but you can also get Perona back because she is a Thriller Bark Pirate. So for 5 mana total, even if if you hard cast the Moria, but 3 for the Dofi skill, you can actually get back this Perona and then play her for 1 so you can sculpt the top 5 cards of your deck again. Coming up after the Moria is 3 copies of the Vanilla Pacifista from the starter deck. Now I see why you play this card. There are 2 Pacifistas. One is the blocker from the main set, and one is this Vanilla from the starter deck. The reason I like the starter deck one is because it doesn't have anything to do with his attack. It has to do with the fact that he can guard. The Pacifista blocker does not have guard, and that makes hands with him actually pretty awkward. And it has come up when I've playtested this deck. I do actually like the Pacifista, although I've moved away from it in recent testing. Martial D Teach, we have 2 copies of him, 4-drop 4k, playable off the Dofi. On play, return a character with a cost of 3 or less to the owner's hand, so that will trigger if he's played off the Dofi. I do like that he's a 2-of. I'm playing 4 just for like maximum amount of targets in my build. But as soon as there was something better, I would replace him, so I am not, weird about 2 copies at all. I do not play this Moria in my list. This is 4 cost 5k. It says during your turn, if you have 5 or more cards in your hand, this character gains double attack. So that means he does 2 damage when he hits. It's interesting, I think, play testing with it at 2 copies is a fine idea. I would definitely try it. 5 or more cards in your hand in this deck in particular is not hard because of Boa that we're going to talk about in a bit. But other than that, he is a vanilla. So he's not playing the Edward Weevil vanilla, so that's fine. I think that makes sense. 4 copies of Boa. Boa is a very powerful card in this deck. She is a blocker, she is playable off the Dofi, and with Dawn under her when attacking or on block, you get to draw a card if there are 5 or less cards in your hand. And this deck can field multiple Boa very easily because you will be going through your deck very fast with the Dofi and with the Perona checks and drawing. You'll be able to see at least 2 copies of this relatively soon in all of your games. There are multiple times in playing this deck where you have to play cards from your hand just so you can plus again off the Boa because your hand will get pretty big. He is playing 2 copies of the Virgo vanilla. Now unfortunately this card is not playable off the Dofi because that stat line is very nice. A 5-drop vanilla with 7,000 power, and he has guard. So that is always nice, but that extra power can come up in this deck because if you've been playing this deck, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of beaters. So having that extra muscle is pretty nice. Opting to play 2 copies of the super rare 7-drop Dofi from the starter deck with 7k, on play return any character with cost 7 or less to the owner's hand. I unfortunately am not a big fan of this card in particular. I think that skill doesn't super warrant the 7-drop because it doesn't permanently remove the threat, whereas our big Mihawk over here does permanently remove the threat. For 9-drop 9k power, on play, place a character with 7 cost or less on the bottom of the owner's deck, not to their hand. It is gone. That's why this is the only big beater that I've been playing in my build. In fact, in my build, I'm only playing 6 cards that are not playable off of this Doflamingo at the moment, which is 4 Perona and 2 copies of this Mihawk. He is actually opting to play events in this list, which I've been messing around with, but as you'll see when you actually start playing the deck, having multiple cards that are not playable off this Dofi will start making your top 5 checks very awkward at times, where you maybe find like one target and it might not even be a good one. And then you have to try and mill through those 4 other cards because they're not going to be able to be played off the Dofi. But Desert Sparta is a solid card for the deck. At 1 cost, you get to give something 2,000 power and then look at the top 3 cards of your deck and rearrange them to try and set up for your Dofi. And then the trigger is draw 2, discard 1 from hand, so the trigger is good. 4 copies of Level of Beam. This is a very good blue staple event card, but like I said earlier, events are actually kind of awkward in this deck, and you might want to think about the number that you're playing. But it gives you 4,000 power, and then you get to draw a card if you have 3 or less cards in your hand. And then 2 copies of the Overheato. It is another 2 cost that gives you plus 4k, and then you can bounce an active character with cost 3 or less to the owner's hand, and then on trigger, return a character with a cost of 4 or less to the owner's hand. So I think the list is pretty solid. I was messing around with this vanilla Pacifista. I think it's interesting because you can play it off of the Kuma. The events were kind of cloggy for me. I don't know how they were for him, but he is playing 8 of them, and he's also playing the 2 Dofi, the 2 Mihawk, the 2 Virgo, and then the Perona and the Alvida, and the Pacifista, which none of which are playable off of the Dofi leader skill. And when I was playing the list, when it had that many non-targets for the Dofi, it was getting a little cloggy. So it's something to think about. But he did manage to get first place, so he definitely knows something about what he's doing at least, right? But I think that does about it for now. So that was today's deck check, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Let us know what your favorite leader is in the first One Piece format down below, and we'll see you next time, YouTube.